Rory Stewart, hello. How's it going?
Very well, and thank you for having me on Skype.
You had to draw attention to it, didn't you? There's there's plenty to talk about. There's plenty for us to talk about in the national news, but I thought we might as well start with you. What have you been up to? Where have you been? Why don't you tell us that?
So I'm in the United States. I've just got back from Afghanistan. I got back 4 days ago, and I was in Kabul, and I was in Bamiyan in the Central Mountains, and looking at a charity that I set up 15 years ago, and my wife now runs.
So you were just saying then before we started the interview proper that Afghanistan has suffered quite badly from the coronavirus. Is that what you went over there to look into and to deal with, or was it something else related to your charity?
Well, one of the things we found out is that nearly 70–80% of the employees of our charity have had COVID. And the World Health Organization estimates that perhaps as many as 10 million people out of sort of 26 million in Afghanistan have had COVID. It's very difficult to know because the data is very difficult. Many Afghans don't want to admit they've had it. It's got social stigma attached. It gets in the way of people's travel and funerals and this, that, and the other. But it seems, at least from the people we know in Kabul, as though the numbers are extraordinary. And it has got close to this idea of herd immunity. But along the way, of course, many, many, many people have died.
So from a public health approach, from a governance approach, how have tribal leaders, how has the government in Afghanistan, how have they tried to remedy this situation?
Well, it's very difficult in Afghanistan. I mean, they firstly tried to control the borders and tried to put a lockdown in place. But of course, there simply is not the health infrastructure in Afghanistan to deal with this. So many people will have died without having made it to a clinic or to a hospital at all. And the numbers are very difficult to estimate. People are trying to get to estimates either, as the WHO does, by doing random surveys or by interviewing grave diggers and talking about the number of people that are being buried in particular places. But if it's true that 10 million people have had it, we can probably assume that as many as 100,000 people will have died.
That's absolutely tragic. How were people trying to mitigate the virus in their local communities? Was there any action that they could take? I mean, how have they been trying to?
It's very difficult, partly because traditionally it's a very, very physical, tactile culture. So a lot of the Afghans that I saw wanted to hug me and kiss me, and so it's quite difficult keeping that kind of distance. It's also a culture where it's very important to turn up for family events like funerals, which really increases the chance of contagion. And people's houses are small, ventilation is not good, masks and personal protection equipment wasn't available. It's one of the big untold stories of coronavirus. We don't know across the developing world exactly what's happening. Some countries have locked down very, very aggressively. Jordan, for example, seems to have very few cases. Some states in India have very, very few cases. Other states seem to have a lot. Places like Myanmar, Burma seem to have no cases, and now suddenly is spiking in a very extreme way.
So the region that you were visiting, is that the place you've been before? Obviously, you've walked across the country. You've seen a lot of it, and your charity operates out of there. Was it a region you're familiar with? Were you visiting people that you've met before? Tell us about it.
Yeah. So I was up in Bamiyan in the Central Mountains, which is where famously there were these huge Buddhas which were blown up by the Taliban, leaving these great niches. These are Buddhas that are well over 1,000 years old, which were destroyed by the Taliban. It's a very beautiful place. It's a place which could be an amazing tourism center for Afghanistan if security improved. But the sad truth is that I walked across the country nearly 20 years ago now, and I assumed at the time that things would just get safer. But in fact, they haven't. It's probably more dangerous now than it has been in the past. Not so much in Bamiyan in central Afghanistan, but certainly in places like Kabul. Not just terrorism now, but kidnapping. A lot of people being kidnapped for money. And it's heartbreaking because Afghanistan is one of the most beautiful places on earth. Afghans are incredibly, wonderful people. I mean, I love being in that country, but it still probably isn't yet in a position for a full tourism industry.
What sort of if there's risk of kidnapping Kabul, I mean, what sort of security precautions do you take when you visit?
Well, that's difficult because obviously, as an ex-British minister, I don't want to get other people in danger, and groups could think it's funny to kidnap me. So I have to be very careful, and that involves my being quite careful not to tell people when I'm coming, not to explain to people where I'm coming, not to set any preset patterns, so that if you turn up unexpectedly for a short period and then leave immediately.
Got you. And as you mentioned, you're currently talking to me from America. What's going on over there? Has Boris Johnson exiled you? Is that why you're stateside?
Well, that's what my son believes. My son has, I think, got the wrong end of the stick. So Boris, obviously, when he came in, I lost my job in the cabinet, and then I lost my job as a member of parliament, which also meant that we lost our house in Cumbria and our whole life there. So my son is now thinks that Boris is like sort of Henry VIII, that he's kind of stripped everything from me, my job, my house, my livelihood.
What are you doing in the US? Are you teaching? I know it's something you've done in the past.
Yes, I'm teaching at Yale University. I'm teaching seminars to students. I'm trying to teach about politics. I'm trying to make people understand how strange a politician's life is, get into the mindset of a Boris or a Trump, or indeed any politician, and make people understand how what seems sensible, why it doesn't happen, why politicians find it difficult to deal with COVID, why they find it difficult to do almost anything.
And at Yale, you're probably going to be instructing at least some of the next generation of leaders. But on a more topical note, let's say, obviously one of the things that distinguished you during the Tory leadership race was your position on Brexit. And really with the negotiations, at least if you were paying attention to the public rhetoric, you would say that the negotiations are really coming to a crunch now. Big talk, threats about no deal from Johnson, and accusations about who's at fault for the stall in talks. What's your read on recent events, the events of the last week?
Well, I think the first thing is it's very important to remember that no deal is not a thing. It's not a destination. It's not a thing. It's an absence of a thing. It's just saying there isn't a deal. And it leaves all the big questions still to be answered. So if you got no deal, you failed to make an agreement with the European Union. You've dropped into WTO terms, which are literally the worst terms that you can have for trading with anybody. And then you've got to pull yourself out of that situation and negotiate a new deal in the future. So people who are excited by no deal are missing the point that no deal is just the beginning of a very painful, lengthy process of trying to bring another deal together. But bringing it together, unfortunately, from a position of weakness, because you're having to start from a situation in which you've already disentangled yourself from the EU, in which your farming industry, your automobile industry will be beginning to suffer because it'll be facing European Union tariff barriers, and potentially also getting cheap imports in from the United States and other countries.
And one other area that was actually raised in the Commons today by Theresa May, former Prime Minister, was that of security cooperation. And as Michael Gove was responding to her, he said that whether there was a deal or in the absence of one, security cooperation with the EU would improve. And the cameras cut to former Prime Minister May on the back benches, and she was still going, "What?" Which is unusual for someone who you're used to being so sort of steely faced and giving away so little. It was quite compelling to see her displaying that much emotion. I mean, I feel like it goes without saying, but on this point of security cooperation, it doesn't really stand to reason, does it, that it's going to improve if we don't negotiate something with the European Union?
I mean, that's a bizarre rhetorical move. To suggest it's going to get better is extraordinary. I mean, at the moment, we have full access to databases. We have arrest warrants that we share in common. The challenge about leaving the system is almost certainly that cooperation will get worse. It'll be more difficult to track European Union citizens in the United Kingdom citizens, European Union, and indeed non-EU citizens traveling through those two places where we used to share databases and share rules. So from a security and justice point of view, it is difficult.
Yes, and only going to become increasingly difficult if that's the course of action that happens. Obviously, you know Theresa May quite well. And for me, one of the sort of, call it an underrated storyline, if you like, but it's been sort of how she must feel during this process to see, sort of what was essentially, she was undermined by Boris in relation to her deal, comes back with what is virtually a carbon copy of it, dresses it up as something else. I mean, what's your read on it? How do you think she feels during all this process, watching Johnson go about setting about doing what she tried and failed to do?
Well, I think it must be extraordinary for her. So I actually believe that Remainers will look back and conclude that they made a mistake not supporting a soft Brexit. I can understand many people felt at the time that Brexit was such a bad idea that there was going to be a second referendum and there was no need to Brexit at all. So whenever you talked about a soft Brexit, whenever I was talking about a soft Brexit, people would say, well, but that's worse than being in the European Union. And they wouldn't accept my answer at the time, which was, yeah, but we're leaving the European Union because there's been this referendum. They thought there could be a second referendum. The result is, I'm afraid, that we're going to end up much more likely to end up with a no-deal Brexit, not just because of the hard Brexiteers, but also because the Remainers rubbished Theresa May's deal so completely when it came out. And I think it's a very, very, it's something that haunts me. Why were we not able to convince people that if we were going to leave the European Union, it was better to do so with something like a customs union?
Yeah, I remember you making the argument at the time, saying that the deal was there, and that pursuing it, and to a certain extent, I think you were viewed as a little bit of a pariah because, as you said, so many people, whether they were Remainers or they were on the harder Brexit side of the argument, they viewed it as inadequate. And I think it probably speaks to a broader point, which is sort of something that you tried to channel in your Tory leadership campaign, and again with your mayoral bid, compromise, consensus, and something I know you like, the centre ground.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing, that the argument that I tried to make, which is one of the reasons to go for a soft Brexit, was to try to heal the country and bring it together. I tried to say that one of the reasons why we should have had a soft Brexit is not just that I happen to believe that a customs union was better for British farming or British car industry than leaving. It was also that I was looking for a way to bring the country together. I felt that it had been a 52-48 referendum and we needed a 52-48 Brexit, something that people who voted Remain could get alongside and people who voted Brexit could get alongside, because the point was that this deal wasn't just meant to be for the next few months, it was meant to be for the next 20, 30 years. And I completely failed to convince anyone of that. We've got a culture where people feel that they're rewarded for being obdurate, for just digging their heels in and saying no, and that in the end they'll get what they want. And I never managed to convince my friends who believed in a second referendum that they were not going to get it, and that by pushing for it, they were running the risk of a Boris Johnson government and a harder Brexit.
Gosh, I think that'll probably be quite a heavy burden. I don't know who specifically you're talking about, but I imagine the sort of the Dominic Grieves and such of this world on the soft side of the Tory party, if they were to carry that on their conscience, they might probably wear quite heavy on them. Are you still in touch with any of your old cabinet colleagues? Do you still reminisce about your fond times around that table?
I a little bit. I mean, I'm very fond of David Gauke, who was the Justice Secretary and who I admire a lot. I don't miss politics, to be honest. I mean, I found it, by the end, having been through Brexit and the leadership and then the London mayoral race, so bruising, so strange. And I'm in a sort of, I'm afraid, in a sort of recovery where I'm enjoying getting back to Afghanistan. I'm enjoying teaching. I'm enjoying spending time with my family, but I'm not really looking for chances to ring my colleagues and reminisce about the good old days.
You're still teaching about politics, though, so you can't quite kick the habit. The reason I'm asking actually is because I chatted to Ian Hislop the other day, and he sort of he offered his reason why he thinks we're in such a dire situation we are at the moment, and he offered that it might be because of the lack of talent around the cabinet table, partially because they were largely chosen on their basis of their allegiance to Brexit. But the other thing he also offered was that there's been virtually 10 years of Tory government, and that basically anyone who had any talent has basically left, got bored, been quite bruised, perhaps like yourself, and wanted to leave. I mean, is that an assessment you'd agree with?
I think that it's also true that there's not necessarily much belief in talent in our democratic system. I think the public, at some level, or a lot of the public, is so disillusioned and angry with politicians, imagines that we're all a bunch of liars and criminals and incompetents anyway, that the question of which one of us is relatively more competent than someone else hardly features. And I think that's really important. I was very struck, actually, both during the leadership campaign and during the mayoral campaign, that no journalists ever really talked about my CV, never really talked about whether I was good at running things, whether I'd done a good job as a prisons minister, because the assumption is that I think that the whole system's so broken that we're all so useless anyway, that it doesn't really matter who's in the cabinet. It doesn't really matter whether, the idea that I might have more experience running something than somebody else doesn't really seem to be relevant, or that I might have done a better job as a minister as someone else doesn't seem to be relevant, I think. And that is at the core, I think, of the phenomenon of Trump and to some extent Boris Johnson, which is that all the things that 10, 15 years ago you would expect would cause problems for them don't cause problems for them, because I think expectations are now so low that people almost enjoy the idea of bringing in colourful figures. And that's true of the cabinet. I mean, I think some of them are smart and hardworking, some of them are not. And I'm not sure journalists or the public have very clear ideas on which are which. I think only very, very specialist Westminster watchers actually care very much.
About whether that's important or necessary. I guess that's sort of technocracy versus populism. Well, that's interesting.
And also, sorry, I mean, I think the other thing that's strange is we don't really judge politicians on sticking to what they've said. So it's very striking. You'll find in the cabinet a lot of people who might have lost their jobs because they were fired by previous prime ministers over scandals, or who have stated in the past that they are completely against the no-deal Brexit and are now supporting it, or have stated that they would never work with Boris Johnson, now working with him. But this doesn't seem to be remembered. This is just taken for granted. And that then means that if you are somebody who is trying to campaign assuming that there are certain kinds of rules about certain kinds of expectations on competence, or expectations on following through on what you've said you're going to do, these may not be very useful in a world in which those things are not very relevant, in which people's attention spans are very slow.
That's interesting. And I wanted to ask you then, if you think the bar is so low, what do you think then would constitute a success for the likes of Boris Johnson, let's say? What would constitute a success for Boris Johnson's government?
Well, I think that the prime thing that leaders are interested in, I think it's inevitable, is winning elections. Often they don't have much idea of what they really want to do with the power when they've got it. Boris has a general idea that Britain's a great country, and he's going to be a sort of cheerleader. He's going to go around saying, we're great, it's going to be great, it's all going to be fine. But he doesn't necessarily have a very detailed picture of what exactly he wants to reform day in, day out. He's chosen, though, to bring in Dominic Cummings, who, with Michael Gove, seems to have his own very clear ideas about two things. One of them is about reforming the civil service, and the other one is about trying to level up and rebuild the economy of Northern England. And I guess Boris is supporting that, allowing him to get on with that. But those are very interesting projects because they're very long-term projects. They're not things where it's likely that even if you were successful, you'd see much result within 5 or 10 years. They're not really electoral projects. So, for example, levelling up, sorting out the economy in Northern England is about building roads and rail infrastructure, which will take 15, 20 years to build. Very, very long time before you have a result. Let's say you concluded that one of the great advantages of France is that in cities outside Paris, they have underground systems. So that what you wanted to do was build an underground system in Birmingham or Manchester. That's a project that would take you 20 years to do, judging by how long Crossrail takes to do. The train line that's meant to connect Leeds and Manchester again is something that people are talking about starting in 15 years' time. So these are good things to do, but they're not things which people are going to see quickly. They're not going to have much impact on short-term politics.
And so, are you advocating then that Boris Johnson should be pursuing more short-termist electoral policy? Is that what you're advocating for?
No, in a way, I like the fact that this is a government that's interested in civil service reform. I don't agree the type of reform they're bringing, but I like the fact they're doing it, because when I was in government and I wanted to talk about civil service reform, the normal response was, oh, for goodness sake, don't be ridiculous. Nobody cares about civil service reform. You know, the journalists don't care, the public don't care, don't waste your time doing it. So I think it's good that they care about it. I think they've got a very unrealistic idea about what they're trying to do. And I'm worried that Dominic Cummings has this sort of Dr. Strangelove idea that the ideal civil service is some sort of US nuclear weapon building program from the late 1940s. And that the thing that stays in the way of success is too much health and safety. And the great thing about the Manhattan Project is you just put on some sunglasses when you let off the atom bomb and everybody was fine.
Then, of course, for all the goodwill, for all the ambition in the world, this pandemic has happened, and one questions how much oxygen there is within the government and civil service to deal with anything other than dealing with the pandemic, its immediate fallout, and the long-term consequences, which we're going to be feeling for generations.
The pandemic, potentially, as the Bank of England says, is leading to the worst recession in 300 years. I mean, it's completely off the charts what this means. In a very small way, if you take a small example, I was running to be Mayor of London in the spring of this year, and the three issues that I was campaigning on were knife crime, affordable housing, and air quality. All those political issues suddenly changed overnight with COVID. You know, they came down by 30% in about 2 months. Now, things that nobody was thinking about in January, like mass unemployment, suddenly matters. If I take my old constituency, Penrith and the Border, before COVID, it had the second highest employment rates in the whole of Britain, and 90% of people were employed. In fact, long-term unemployed in my constituency, there were 58 people.
Wow.
And COVID has meant that it is now the second worst affected anywhere in the country. 45% of the eligible population has been furloughed. So everything's changed. It's gone from a place where the one thing that nobody was worried about was unemployment, where literally anybody coming to my constituency surgery, if they wanted a job, I could basically get them a job, to a situation in which almost half the eligible population has had to be furloughed. I mean, these are things that I don't think any politician has begun to get their head around.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was the last time you and I spoke was about 7 months ago or so. And like you said, it was a lifetime ago. You candidate to be Mayor of London, that's no longer the case. But something that you did in that interview was you called for an earlier lockdown than many others were even suggesting or saying that it was an acceptable idea. In fact, you were denounced as a little bit of a crank, I think, for suggesting it and for doing so. And to a certain extent, I mean, you've been vindicated in the time since. I mean, I know it's pretty morbid to say, but I mean, do you feel vindicated, or I mean, do you feel tragic? I mean, what's your response to seeing that call that you made and how it could potentially have had a really significant impact on what happened after?
Well, I think, look, I appreciate it was a difficult call. I disagree with the government. I thought that the advice they were getting was not the right one, and they should have been challenging it, and it was up for politicians to make the decision. And I felt that they needed to move much more quickly. So I've been saying this, I guess, from the end of February, and I believe very strongly that the answer was to lock down very, very quickly, and that if we lock down quickly enough, we might be able to come out of it more quickly too. And I do believe, to some extent, that is true. I had seen already, it was obvious by the time we did that interview, that is what, in effect, Taiwan was doing. That's what China was doing. And I couldn't see why we shouldn't be trying to do the same thing. They didn't do that. And I can also understand why, because I was a minister sitting around that table, why it's sometimes quite difficult to make those kind of arguments, because it's difficult to be the odd voice out. It's difficult to challenge the conventional wisdom. It's difficult to say, I think we're getting this all wrong and we're going to have to do something very different, particularly when it's going to be very costly. I mean, at the time, everybody was saying, what do you mean you want to stop people traveling on the tubes? I mean, it's going to bankrupt the tube system. And what's going to happen if we close schools? I mean, how are people going to be? So I can completely understand that. But I do think that generally in any crisis, and coronavirus is no exception to it, act early, no regrets, throw the kitchen sink at it straight away. And if you're lucky, you can come out of it more quickly.
Often the charge that's leveled at us at the moment is, if you want to make international comparisons, that the UK has suffered the worst in terms of its economy. It's one of the worst in terms of its economy, and it's also suffered a pretty horrific death toll. Do you think there's an argument that is exclusively to do with the government, or something that has been suggested? People often making these international comparisons. So, as you said, Taiwan, you could look to South Korea, you could look to New Zealand. However, those countries, they're not really the sort of international hubs in the same way that the UK is, and particularly the way that London is, i.e., the sort of the gateway to Europe for the US and vice versa and all the rest of it. Do you think, regardless of how it was managed, that the UK was perhaps always going to suffer worse than our international comparisons because of the nature of our standing and our role in the global community?
So I think we could have done much better, but it was always going to be horrifying. It was always going to be very difficult, partly because we're very dependent on services and face-to-face services. In London, nearly 85% dependent on services, many of which were crippled by coronavirus. I also think that we don't have what Germany had, which was a very good pre-existing localized test and trace system in place. So it was always going to be very difficult. I don't see, though, why the government couldn't have moved more quickly. I don't see why they couldn't have decided, for example, to shut down flights coming in from Milan, when Milan was one of the hot spots. It was extraordinary. I don't know whether you remember this. Passengers coming off those flights in Milan saying nobody tried to stop us at the airport, nobody tried to talk to us, nobody tried to quarantine us. So I think that had we moved more quickly to shut it down, the numbers would have been more controllable. I don't know whether they could have managed the test and trace system better. I imagine they could. It seems to me that that is basically a project management problem. That doesn't mean we could have done it as well as Germany, because we don't have all that infrastructure in place, but I still think we could have done it better. On the other hand, it was always going to be horrifying. And I think that to some extent, it's not fair comparing somewhere like Britain to, for example, Singapore, because we're a much, much bigger, much more open, much more complicated society that was always going to face problems that smaller places don't.
It's the track and trace system, rather, that sort of sees us now.
Is it not test and trace? I thought track and trace was a post office system.
Rory, please don't. I wouldn't know the word for it. The system by which you contact trace people who have tested positive and their contacts and who they've come into contact with, and then informing those people to isolate, would be how you would say it in a sentence. That system, because it's not functioning, we sort of find ourselves trapped in this sort of cyclical lockdown process, i.e., the nation grinds to a halt. We start to ease off, and as a result of that, the virus resurfaces, it's resurgent. And really, without that in place, you're basically trapped in this endless process of.
So you've got to. I think you have to get there. I mean, I'm not as gloomy as people who say it's inevitable that we can't do it, that somehow Germany has such deep inherent advantages that we can never get to a good system. I'm sitting here in New Haven in the United States, and the system for testing is pretty impressive. I can go in, and I'm going to do this in an hour's time. I will drive in with my wife and kids into a testing center. We will park the car in the car park. We will be tested and out the door within about 90 seconds. You walk in, you're handed a little test tube. You stick your own thing up your nose 5 times, stick it back in test tube. You've got a barcode on the side. You get your results often certainly within 24 hours. And it's really impressive. And it can be done. Now, of course, a lot of the rest of the United States is not doing it. So the point is that America is quite a good example. America, like Britain, is a very, very big, very complicated, very open country. But the fact is that if it's being done well in some places, there's a clue there that you can scale it up. And nothing of what I'm seeing when I'm doing these tests here strikes me as being impossible to replicate across the country. I cannot understand why you could not, in pretty much any city and town in the United Kingdom, have similar systems. And yes, they're costly, but anything that you pay for it is worth it, because the impact on our economy is so extreme. And once you get it right, which is what's true here, it becomes much, much easier for people to confidently do stuff, open up. For example, my children are in school all the time, and the schools are not being shut down. I'm teaching in a classroom when there are other students in the classroom. We're confident doing that because we've all been tested. Yeah, and restaurants are operating, and people are learning more and more about when to use masks and where to sit. And I mean, you can live.
Yeah, it's one of the big things that stands in the way, really, and why we're still finding ourselves in this process. I mean, I put forward the argument last week and got received a fair amount of flack for doing so, I should say, that perhaps one way out of it could be that in these areas where we're seeing high rates, that we sort of lock down the most at-risk part of the population, i.e. the elderly, and we allow younger people to sort of go out and return to perhaps not life as before, but at least be going to work, at least be being able to visit local businesses and stimulate them with their cash. I wonder what you make of that argument, that perhaps the people for which...
There's definitely something in that argument, because, of course, this is a very strange disease. Spanish influenza, young people were very vulnerable. This is a disease in which basically the older you get, the more vulnerable you are, except for people with certain specific conditions. And the longer this goes on, the more pressure there will be to say, let's focus on the people who are most vulnerable to this disease and allow others to move around. But two provisos. One of those is that if you get it wrong, you're going to overwhelm the health system. So you have to make sure that you're not going to let it spread so much that you're going to end up with more cases than hospitals can handle. That's one of the problems with the traditional herd immunity theory, is that you end up with so many cases coming to hospital, you basically crash the system. The second question is how you support and deal with vulnerable people in that situation, and the interaction between younger people and vulnerable people. What is going to be the relationship between you and, I don't know, elderly relatives of yours or vulnerable friends of yours? What are the rules going to be on how you interact with them? How do you arrange that? That said, I think there's no doubt, Ollie, brutally speaking, if a vaccine does not come soon, we are going to have to look logically at those kinds of things. They're going to have big practical problems, big moral problems, but it's going to be very, very difficult ultimately, if we're going to live with this, not to move into a world in which either you get your test and trace right, which is what we're doing, I believe, here, or if you really have given up on test and trace, you may have to go down that route.
Yeah, that's the worrying thing about the vaccine, isn't it? I've interviewed immunologists who say, if it was best case scenario, beginning of next year, that would be essentially a world first, a marvel of modern medicine. And it's very common for a vaccine to take 2, 5, maybe even 10 years at a time. I'd like to move on, though, and talk a little bit about the national politics of where you find yourself now, Rory, the presidential election. I'm assuming you're not an advocate of Donald Trump, but I wondered if you could would you describe yourself as pro-Joe Biden?
Well, that's a really good challenge. I mean, I definitely think President Biden is a huge amount better than Donald Trump. We have my wife is an American citizen, and we have a Joe Biden sign on our lawn. We have a very small lawn.
Did you hammer it in, though?
I did not. Although actually our neighbor has got a big Trump flag up. So this is, we're right in the middle of all of this. And of course, as you can imagine, a bit like Brexit, this is completely passionately felt. So my wife, her friends, her parents basically think that anyone who votes for Trump is evil. I mean, maybe I'm exaggerating that, but there is a very, very profound cultural war going on in the United States. And that's very worrying, because as someone who advocates the center ground, I really want to try to help people to feel sympathy for their fellow citizens. And it's about half the population. That's why it feels like Brexit are voting. They can't all be evil people. Right? So that's one problem. The second problem is it makes you very uncritical of your own side. So I can see a lot of problems with Vice President Biden. I thought his debate performance was lamentable. And I think that the problem is that nobody wants to point out what those problems are because nobody wants to give any sort of solace to Trump. It was very similar when I was International Development Secretary. You weren't allowed to point out any of the problem with our aid programs because people were terrified if you ever admitted that we were making mistakes with our aid program, it would be used to destroy the aid programs entirely. So everybody went around piously pretending that it was all going very well when obviously it wasn't. And one of the things that worries me with Biden is that he seems, anecdotally from the people that I know and dealt with him, to be very, very anti-British and to talk a lot about being anti-British.
Yeah, there's that the sort of the Irish vote connection, isn't there, for the Democrats that sort of perhaps fosters that. You mentioned his debate performance there. As a veteran of televised debates yourself, I wonder if you had any advice for him. I mean, perhaps you're not wearing a tie now, but perhaps to take it off and use
taking
it.
Off the tie, yeah, that's,
yeah,
did not work for me on it.
Using it to choke Trump into silence, perhaps.
Exactly. I think the key dealing with Trump is to understand that he's not going to give you your 2-minute speech. Biden had prepared clearly these long 2-minute speeches. You have to assume the guy's going to keep interrupting you. And really depressing though it is, it was necessary, I felt, for Biden to show his teeth and push back occasionally. Some people didn't like the fact that he said this guy's a clown and yada, yada, yada. I thought that if he hadn't done that, it would have been very difficult because Trump was trying to bully him, trying to dominate him. That doesn't look good in a presidential debate. So you've got to find a way of pushing back. I think that it would be good, though, also for Biden to find a few positive things to say about his own program. It seemed to me that too much of this in the end is just directed against Trump. Now, that's kind of working for him, but it would be nice for government and politics in general if he told us a little bit about what he was going to do. And the problem there is that the Democratic Party is much more split than I think people in Britain acknowledge. So it's very difficult for him actually to lay out what his policy is on healthcare because his own party is tearing itself to bits. The Bernie Sanders wing wants a sort of NHS system. Other people don't want to touch that kind of system. So he almost can't talk about those things.
He can't set out his program, yeah. And yet it might still be enough for him to beat Trump. I mean, the polling, I mean, it looks like it's going to be a massacre. At certain points, people were saying that about 2016. Can I draw you into a prediction, Rory? Will you dare?
My prediction will be that Biden will win. And it's interesting because we live in an age of populism in which we feel that the advantages generally lie with celebrity showmen. And that this sort of strong, macho, not very detail-oriented swagger is what wins. So it's reassuring that Trump is likely to lose. It's very odd that the person that's going to defeat him is somebody who is quite as old and stiff and non-celebrity-like as Biden. And yet, and this is my real problem, I think in general, the populists still have the advantage in elections. So Biden may win this one, but I think we need to understand that in the United States, in Britain, and around the world, we are moved into a period, partly driven by social media, where very, very coarse, black and white statements win, and where people are not very focused on details, on competence, on track records.
Rory Stewart, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ollie. That's really kind. Thank you. Bye-bye.